with a very simple provocation. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
This is the question, one of the question, and I'd like I'd like in this hour to try to give an answer, maybe more than one answer to this question. We work a lot on a UNESCO site, but it is not only a problem for UNESCO site. It's a problem for, in general, for cultural heritage, for people who work with cultural heritage. And maybe this is not the only problem. Now in Italy, we think that if we wash our hands, all will be well. But maybe it's not only the COVID the problem. We are going to have another wave, that is the recession, maybe in 2021, and then the climate change. So how in this complex system, the cultural heritage and the UNESCO could be something that give value to the system? And do you think that it's possible to use this cultural heritage as an example, as a laboratory to learn some way to solve COVID, but also recession, but also climate change? I think that this could be the first question, and I give the floor to our Brazilian friend to try to give an answer. Aspetta che chiudo la cosa. So Rafael, is your turn.
Oh, that's a very it's a very challenging question you've put for me there. I'm gonna present an experience. Let me share my screen. Okay, so can you see my
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience with managing the UNESCO site of Pampulha, which has become a UNESCO site 4 years ago. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to answer the challenge you have set for me, but I have some indications that might be useful for us, and I think I'm well. Let's see if we can advance this subject a little bit. Let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm currently the director of research for the Urban Policy Secretariat of the city. I'm also a doctoral student at UFMG, or doctoral candidate, if you will, according to some of the criteria used by some politicians in Brazil. I am already a doctor, but I'm not really. Brazilians will get the joke. And well, and we've been doing some work on Pampulha, and also at the same time doing some research of using aerial photogrammetry for gathering data and managing some of the urban policies. And I think that's fortunately that's something that moves us a little bit closer to being able to cope with climate change. And so fortunately I will have something to show you, though the presentation is not geared towards it specifically. And well, in this presentation, I'm going to go through is first I'm going to present you the context a little bit very quickly, talk a little bit about Pampulha, and also about our new city master plan, which is very much geared towards trying to stop a little bit climate change in whatever scale the city can do that. And some of the main subject of my presentation is how to reconcile cultural heritage management and urban planning. How do you make them talk to one another and answer one another's needs and expectations? So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pampulha, but a little bit about our new city master plan, which has been approved last year and gotten into effect last February. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience with simulating some of the impacts on landscape that the new master plan might have. And at the end, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we're using photogrammetry for simulating landscape in real life, real world simulation, and also for managing and advancing some of the UN objectives, like sustainable development goals of the United Nations, which is what our new city master plan is based on. So Pampulha is built around an artificial lake that was built in 1942, around 1940. It was concluded in 1943, the building of Pampulha. And its most notable cultural aspect is it's probably the first major project done by Oscar Niemeyer, which is the most famous Brazilian architect so far. And we have like a few very interesting buildings around there. There's a nice looking church, which was built in 42, 43. We have what used to be a casino and now is an art museum. And the nature and architecture talk a lot with each other in Pampulha, and that's certainly why UNESCO chose to declare this cultural heritage site. And we have already in place some kind of protection and building limitations around Pampulha. We've had that for quite a while, and some of these protections, they're pretty straightforward. There's not much else to it. You just around the lake, you don't allow for buildings that are very conspicuous. They're very tall, that will affect the landscape too much. They should blend in with the landscape, and that's been that way since Pampulha was inaugurated. So the immediate adjacency, can you see my cursor? Or I don't see it. Can anyone see if I move my mouse around?
Actually not.
No, yeah.
We just see your first page of the presentation, the black one with the title, but okay. We are not seeing the other slides.
Okay, so let me go back then.
Now it's okay.
Let me stop sharing my screen and I'll share it again after I go into full screen mode.
Good.
Okay, so it's a good thing you said you warned me. So is it okay now? Can you see it full screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Try to change your yeah, good. Now it's okay.
Yes, it's working now.
So very quickly, just running through what I said before. I'm going to talk about Pampulha and the new city master plan. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about building restrictions related to site preservation, about the traditional process of building restrictions, like just limiting heights to a certain arbitrated number. A little bit about the parametric processes that we have done in some parts of Pampulha, and what we're doing right now, which is using aerial photogrammetry from images from drones to actually recreate the entire landscape and then make decisions out of it. So this is Pampulha seen from the air. So it's a part of the city where nature and architecture blend in mostly. And I've lived my whole life in a house right here, so I have a really soft spot for Pampulha. And so these are the Oscar Niemeyer buildings, the main ones. This is the church, there's the casino, and then there's the Casa do Baile, which is a ballroom house that hasn't been used as a ballroom, but it's mostly a cultural building for expositions and so forth. And this is the map. So can you see my mouse now?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay, excellent.
It works.
Okay, so since Pampulha was inaugurated, perhaps most of the areas adjacent to the lake have been protected some way. So there have been height limitations or floor area limitations or some kind of limitation that tries to preserve the aspect, the natural aspect of the site. Of course, there's always been a lot of pressure from developers to like allow for tall buildings around somewhere, maybe not close to the Oscar Niemeyer sites, but far from them. There's been a lot of resistance towards that, so fortunately that's been held back so far, and I think it's going to be with UNESCO. The UNESCO status, it's going to be a lot easier to hold back those efforts right now. So that's we have like a traditional way of preserving the landscape, and it works very well for these immediate adjacencies of the lake and of the site. But we have a different preoccupation right now with the new master plan. It's a very strong part of the new master plan is the transit-oriented development way of thinking. So the main corridors in the city, this is Pampulha, this is the Pampulha Lake, so the sites are around here. And the main corridors around the city are where most of the development is expected, is stimulated to happen in the next few years. There's a very large avenues. This is Antônio Carlos, which is many lanes wide, and this is Cristiano Machado, and this is here Antônio Carlos, and then Pedro I. This avenue here is called Pedro I. This is a very large corridor. So if you're developing towards transit-oriented development, these are parts where there are probably going to be a lot of constructions in the near future. So one big question that needs to be answered is, okay, we're preserving the immediate adjacencies of the lake, but will developments a little bit far from the immediate adjacencies impact the landscape somehow, and should we do something about that? So around here, for instance, you have no limitations right now, and in this part as well. So the first question is, even though they're not immediately close to the lake, will new buildings be, very conspicuous in the landscape? Will they make the landscape a little bit worse once they happen? And of course, that's not a very easy thing to do, because you have to kind of guess how developers and architects are going to design their buildings in those parts of the city. So those two parts I pointed for you, this part here and this part here are parts where we wanted to answer the question of, will they impact landscape in a significant way? And if they will, should we put in place some kind of limitation in those areas as well to make sure they don't? So when you see red here, that's like a very dense building. That's a floor area ratio of 5, and that's net floor area ratio. So you have a gross area ratio, floor area ratio of 8.5 around here where it's painted red. So you tend to have very tall buildings, but at the same time, this is a much lower part of the city than the lake. There's a dam here, and so this part is lower. So will topography be enough to protect the landscape from the lake, or are those buildings going to be are they going to make the landscape look bad from the lake? So this is, again, people who developed here this are in this room right now, so I'm not going to talk a lot about it. This is the kind of study that helps when you're dealing with built things that already exist. So are the immediate adjacencies of the lake, what's visible from the main sites, and what's very visible or visible from just some parts of the sites. This is a map that's very useful for us to know where do you need to act directly to like, they're already seen from these parts. So whatever you build there is going to impact somehow the landscape for these parts. But here, they're not, because of the topography of the area, they're not immediately visible, but they might become visible if you build too much on them. So that's the study that we wanted to do. The building code in Belo Horizonte is not very simple. I think not many building codes around the world are very simple. It's become much simpler with the new master plan, but it's still very complex in that you can't just extract what the building will look like from the parameters set forth by the master plan. So you have a lot of variables, you have a lot of things to take into consideration, and also market variables, so what the market is willing to build and what people are willing to buy. So you have to take all of that into consideration in order to simulate and project what's going to happen in those areas in the near future. So you probably can, in theory, build a 50-story building with just one room on each floor, but you probably won't do that because it won't make much sense to have all these staircases and elevators to just one room per floor. So you have to have some kind of notion about what the market is building and what people are interested in building to simulate what's going to happen in those areas. So what we did in here is we have parameterized the building code of the new master plan. So, you know, setbacks and floor area ratios and front setbacks, rear setbacks, side setbacks, and maximum heights when they exist, and how setbacks increase as you make the building taller. And with these simulations, we can, using Grasshopper, we can project what's going to happen with the new master plan and see what people will be interested in creating. And if we're going to put in place any kind of limitations in those areas that I mentioned, they need to be very realistic. We know that it's a very big problem when you're not restrictive enough. So you allow people to build things that they shouldn't be able to. They'll just build it and then you're gonna suffer, the landscape will suffer. But you cannot be overly restricted as well, because if you are, people are gonna look badly at the, you know, heritage, cultural heritage and UNESCO status. We have a lot of examples of that. So Ouro Preto, which is a city near Belo Horizonte, has been a UNESCO site for 30 years or more, I think. And they have some parts of the city where you have a building height limitation of 14 meters because of the, you know, landscape preservation of the historical center. But you could build maybe 60 or 70 meters because of topography. It's very hilly, and you wouldn't be able to see it from the city center. So you have a very strict limitation where you don't have to have this. People look badly on cultural site preservation. So the idea is to try and hit exactly what kind of limitation you need to preserve the status of landscape without being more restrictive than that, being overly zealous, because that might be a bad thing for preservation. So with the simulations that we've done, we just, you know, estimating what kind of buildings we're going to have. Of course, they're not going to look like that, but that's like the footprint, the three-dimensional footprint that they might have. And architects might want to work with, you know, the stepped setbacks or just the middle building. But in any case, that's with the parameters we've put in place, that's the kind of impact you might have in one part of the city. So this is just for example. And we can, you know, just adjust those parameters for, you know, floor area ratios and amount of side setbacks that you need to have, what kind of floor height do you have, and a whole bunch of parameters you can adjust to make sure you're simulating realistically what's going to be built in those areas. So once it's done that, that's the simulation is very crude. This is not a very, you don't have textures, you don't have a lot of visual refinements. This is Casa do Baile, so you can see the lake is around here. The topography is, the color of the topography shows you what's higher altitude or lower altitude. And the yellow buildings are what's already constructed, what exists, and the blue and red and green buildings are the buildings that can be built in those areas of the new master plan, those zonings. So what's red here is what you can build in the red zoning that you saw earlier. And there are a lot of assumptions to be made when you do the simulation. You might sometimes join different plots of land together, and you might sometimes just build in one plot of land. And you can parameterize, you can put parameters in all of those aspects. So you can just say, well, whenever you can join different buildings, different plots of land, you will. Or you can say, you know, 50% of the time that's going to happen. You can see some voids in here, some empty spaces. Those empty spaces are just buildings that already exist and they're not going to be renovated. So that's important too. Maybe they're part of the cultural heritage as well. Maybe they're just institutions, public institutions that we know are not going to be transformed into tall buildings in the near future. So we're just working with renewable plots of land around the lake. And when you look at the landscape that those parameters generate, you can see in this case that what we're looking at here is the eastern part of those two parts that I separated, that I'm talking about. This is the eastern part of the two. From the lake, the view on the top here is from the lake level. You can see that the red building and the blue buildings, blue zonings, they're not going to be a problem. They're not visible. You have a very steep hill around here. I've rode down these hills with bikes a lot of times in my life. So you go up and then you go down for the other side. So that landscape there, that topography there, just protects the site. So from the lake you cannot see that part of the Antonio Carlos Avenue. That's one conclusion that we can extract from the simulations. You can see a little bit of the front buildings. There are these two buildings that from the simulation they've taken more than one plot of land and they become taller buildings. So you can see them there just looking a little bit taller than the rest. And from that you can conclude that, well, maybe some kind of limitation or restriction could be put in place in this part specifically, or you can just say, you know, that's okay, we can deal with that kind of impact on the landscape. We're not going to be very radical about not having new buildings show up. They just shouldn't be very, you know, it shouldn't change the characteristic of the site. So maybe that's something you can live with, and you know, that's not necessarily going to happen. And in discussions, you can make the decision in the end. Apparently, the idea is that you can live with that. This is seen from above, so you're lifting, so you're flying from the other side of the lake to see what kind of impact that brings. And you can see that the green building here is overall, it's much taller, even though it's a shorter building. It sits much taller on the landscape because this part here, this blue and red zonings, they're on much lower ground. So they're not as conspicuous as this one is. So that's one thing you can extract from it. And this is the other part of the landscape of the map. Let me just go back real quick to remind you what we're talking about. So this is what we just showed to you. This is the green part, the blue part. Actually, the green part is there's already a limitation in place, so that wouldn't be a problem. And this is the other part we're simulating, this part right here. And when simulating what kind of actual buildings you might have from that, it's become very clear that kind of landscape that might emerge from that part of the city with the new master plan is very different. It's very conspicuous. It shows up a lot. So this is something that might be avoided. You might work to maybe limit, maybe you don't need this kind of building or this kind of building in this landscape. Maybe these lower ones are okay. But this is something that could happen with the new building if you don't put any kind of limitations in place. And at the moment, you don't have those limitations. So that's something that you extract from this process. So just simulating the built environment. We're not just projecting what's visible and what's not from the lake, but we're projecting how visible it's going to be and how that's going to impact the landscape. From certain parts of the Pampulha Lake, you can see the whole city. So it's not realistic to limit constructions in the whole city because of the preservation of the cultural heritage site. But it's reasonable that we are able to simulate what some of them are going to look like and maybe work on those parts and put in place some kind of restrictions in those parts. And that's what's happened in this experience. So for this area here, we're actually doing an advanced study. We're going a step further. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. One important part of this analysis is that they're not final. That's not definitive, but I can, in this case, I just took my laptop with a Grasshopper, installing it and just connected it to a projector, and people can, you know, maybe if we just increase the amount of setback you need to do, maybe that will be limited the building heights indirectly, and maybe that's enough. So maybe we're just, you know, control the landscape in some other way than just setting a rigid height limitation. Maybe we're just going to limit a certain altitude from the sea level instead of a building height. Maybe that's one way of controlling it. We can just go ahead and simulate that. So I think what's the most interesting thing about this kind of process is that it's very collaborative. It's not just technically defined unilaterally by some technician, by me. Just not saying, the numbers show this spot cannot be built above 16 meters or else we're going to have a problem with the landscape. I'm just simulating it, and people are making their own decisions. Maybe a committee, a cultural heritage managing committee, maybe it's the city council, maybe whoever is interested in that, in whoever the stakeholders are, they're interacting with this process instead of just taking a final report and going with it. And in time, you can do more sophisticated simulations. So, for example, in here, that whatever's green in the simulation is going to be seen. It's going to be visible from point one. So you might, instead of just saying this is a limitation, you might just draw a more complex envelope and say you can build whatever you want to build, but it has to be inside this envelope. So of course, it becomes a more complex way of managing the landscape. But if you're talking to the developer and you're saying, well, you can develop a lot in this area, you just can't design whatever you want. You're going to have to sit with us and do a more sophisticated process of designing your building with our help in some ways, and just saying, no, this cannot be visible, this can be visible, but in a different way. And I think that's a very interesting way of reconciling cultural site protection and urban planning. There's a problem with our simulations, though, and that's when I'm gonna. This part here is pretty interesting. I think I'm very excited about what we're doing with this. This here takes into consideration the topography that we have. This is a digital elevation model of the ground, digital terrain model, which is very easy to get. And then the building footprints and heights. And that's what we're seeing here. But those are not the only elements in the landscape. You have vegetation, you have other constructed elements that are not buildings, maybe advertisement billboards, maybe, monuments, and those are very important to simulate as well. So what we're doing, we're advancing it one step further, is we're using aerial reconstruction from not very sophisticated technically. We're not using LiDAR, we're using photogrammetry. This is a very rough approximation of a very big part of the city center. And with that, we can incorporate in Grasshopper a much larger and much more precise area of the city with building heights, with streets, with rivers, with whatever you're viewing from any specific standpoint. And I think that's a very, there's a lot of potential with this process. And it's not easy, not hard to do. It's not done yet for the Pampulha site because we have an airport there, so flying drones around there, it's not that simple. But this is what we're doing for this part here. So instead of just using, the theoretical topography and buildings from the city register, we are using the actual built elements around there, and that includes vegetations and whatever else you have that might block your view from a certain point. So that gives you a very precise, very approximate estimation of what the landscape is going to look like. And another interesting thing about this, and this is being incorporated in the master plan as well, and it's a little deviation from what I expected to talk about today, but since Marco gave us the task of talking about climate change. These photogrammetry surveys, they're very interesting for us to detect what kind of material, what kind of surface is in each part of the model. So it's very easy for us to separate trees from asphalt, from built things, from natural ground. And so we have already in place, and this is the most important thing about this, is this. It's not theoretical. This is not what was approved when each building was approved with the city. This is not something that's in the books. This is very real. So if someone approved a building with a very large garden on the back and then just put concrete over it and it's not pervious anymore, we know this is the 3D reconstruction is going to show us that. And so the interesting thing about it is we can simulate, for example, the water trajectory from when it's raining, stormwater drainage path, and we can, for example, avoid floods, and something that's been happening quite often in Belo Horizonte. We can, something that's already in place with the new master plan is that each plot of land has to manage its entire stormwater drainage. It has to hold its water back to the what we call the primitive flow of the plot of land. So, and this kind of tool here gives us a way of estimating that. So you have the topography, you have the what kind of surface there is. So if it's ground, if it's a vegetation, if it's concrete. So we can estimate how much water is going to be running on each slope. So this is a very interesting thing. And another thing about this process is that a big part of climate change is the heat island effect from built environment. We have a lot of, sun ray absorption in the city, and that makes the city much hotter than around. We have in this part of the city that you're seeing here, maybe 4 or 5 degrees hotter than if you drive maybe 15 minutes in any direction. And that's a big part of climate change as well. So in the end, I think this process not only helps us manage heritage sites and simulate landscapes in a very precise way, but it also allows us to know what's going on in the city and to put in place limitations, restrictions, or obligations that each new developer has to put in place to try to minimize and to ideally reduce to zero the marginal impact of each new building in the city. We have a lot of externalities from new buildings, but we have a lot of technology that allows us to zero those externalities, the negative ones at least, of course. And this process here with the drones, it really helps us to know exactly what we need to achieve that goal. So it works for the cultural sites, the preservation sites. And it works as well for trying to reduce a little bit climate change in the city. So I think that's a big part of the new master plan of Belo Horizonte, and we're really excited about that. I've probably taken much more time than I could. I hope I was clear enough. I would like to talk much more about all of this, and I'm ready to answer questions and talk about any of the subjects that have been put forth, and I hope this was useful for you all. Thank you for your attention, and let's move ahead.
Thank you, Rafael. Marco is speaking, and I have a question. Do you think that this pandemia changed the master plan? Or do you think that after this period, all go in the same direction?
Well, I think in some ways, you probably remember that after 9/11, 2001, there was some talk somewhere about, executive parachutes for people who work in tall buildings and how tall buildings are probably going to be banned. Or there was a lot of talk about the direct impacts of what happened in 9/11 for construction in general. And all that tends to be overhyped, I think. So, for instance, a big part of the new master plan is much larger, much taller buildings that are going to be built, much denser buildings are going to be built in some parts of the city. And some people might say, well, that's very bad for in light of the pandemic. But I don't think, the actual building density is a problem for the pandemic. So I live in a 17-story building here in Belo Horizonte, and it's not the fact that there are 17 or 15 or 12 floors of construction that's going to change how many people are infected by COVID. What does change a little bit, and it has been changing, and we're working on changing that, is street space. So some forms of transportation need to be invested upon, I think. So cycling, something that's most cities in the world are doing right now. That's very good. That's good for the environment. That's good for preventing the spread of disease. Larger sidewalks, that's a very good side effect as well of the pandemic. So I think the core principles of the master plan are not changed by the pandemic. I think some details like street managing, sidewalk guidelines, and maybe something related to how restaurants work, and some details like that might change, and we've been doing some work, at least in the near future, right? So we know apparently it's not going to go away very soon, this pandemic. We need to learn to work with it. So for the near future, next few months, next maybe half a year or a year, we should have some very strong actions in place about limiting the amount of people in public spaces and all that. But in general, I think everything is very much in line with the new master plan. So there's a lot of incentive towards renewable ways of transportation, and that's pandemic might help with that actually. So I think that's it. When people talk about restricting the amount of built area because dense areas tend to spread disease more intensely, I think that's kind of missing the point, because like I said, unless I'm living in a country house in the middle of nowhere, I'm just as exposed living in a 3-story building as I am living in a 17-story building. And of course, everything is very new. This conversation is being recorded, so some people might use it against me in a year or two. I hope not, but that's my view about the subject.
Thank you very much. Are there some more questions?
Marco, may I ask a question? Rogerio is speaking. May I ask?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, Rafael, I would like to thank you very much for your presentation, and also congratulate you for the kind of research you've been doing.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure to see planning instruments moving towards supporting historic preservation strategies.
Mm-hmm.
So I just hope this kind of work being done together, planning and historic preservation sectors of our city continue, which is good news.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
My question has to do with in fact, you kind of approached at the end of your exposition. It has to do with one of the Pampulha's values, also recognized by UNESCO as part of its landscape, which has to do with a kind of 50% ratio between the built environment, the built volumes, and the vegetated volumes.
Mm-hmm.
The so-called paisagem vergel, or green space, as a cultural value also associated to the suburban modern way of living, which has a parameter that is very difficult, in my opinion, to measure or to control, not only because it has to do with a living and very dynamic aspect, which is vegetation, but also because it's very attached to the kind of use of the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
In Pampulha, it used to be related to the strictly residential use,
Mm-hmm.
which has a tendency, as you know, to be substituted to other uses.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, do you think this photogrammetric approach, if I can say like this, could be helpful to construct or to develop guidelines, as we have, as you showed, very, very clear and possible to be measured guidelines and parameters to the built environment? Do you think we have good news as far as developing similar guidelines for the vegetation project as well? And if I can just add a link to the discussion on the new normal, can we say this, for the times after the pandemic? Due to the importance of Pampulha as our open or main open space that is very much used for the population as a whole, how can we expect to have better control over the vegetated landscape? Because, as you know, the 30% minimal permeable control that we have over the plot does not guarantee the final result to the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And also it's very difficult to control from the traditional instruments that we use in planning.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I made myself clear, but that's
yeah, I think so. I think so. When you talk about photogrammetry for controlling the way the vegetated area work with the constructed sites, I think what we can do is we can use these tools to measure to what extent this already happens, and say, well, you can see maybe 85% of the area already respects this limit that we're putting forth, or maybe not, or maybe we're just finding out that just 2% of the environment actually respects these parameters that we're doing. So what I think what actually answers both of your questions, both of your considerations, is that you used to have, with urban planning in Belo Horizonte and most parts of the city or of the world, a one-way flow between the urban parameters and what's actually built. So you have a limitation, that limitation is used for project approval, the project is built, people maybe change the project, maybe they don't, we don't know. And then whatever new limitation you put in place maybe ignores what's actually happened with the old limitations that used to. So I'm saying maybe let's change the amount of vegetation we need in a plot of land from 20% to 30%. And maybe people are already respecting 40%, or maybe people are doing 10% and changing from 20 to 30 is not going to do anything because people are already irregular. So I think that happens a lot. You need to know what actually is going on if you're going to change the parameters, and know what parameters you're going to change and in what way. So you can maybe increase the amount of area, or you can, for example, one thing that's been realized during the construction of the new master plan is that the vegetated area that's in front of the building is much more respected and preserved than the vegetated area that's on the back. So you approve your 20% or 30% on the back of the building. The next day, you're just cementing all over it and building something else over it, and no one's gonna know. But in front of the building is much harder. So that's something that you can extract from the photogrammetry tools. You can say, well, when it's in front, maybe 95% of it is respected. When it's on the back, maybe 20% of it is respected. So maybe in that case, what you need to do is not increase the amount of from 20 to 30, for example, but just say, well, it has to be, or incentivize it to be on the front of the building instead of the back. So what I think this tool does is it closes the loop between what limitations, what guidelines you're putting in place, and what's actually happening in the city. And you can look at that and say, well, these guidelines resulted in this kind of built environment. So what we need to do to adjust this kind of building environment, what we want is change these guidelines in this way specifically. So I think that's what can happen with this process, much more than just increasing or decreasing numbers inside a closed office and not knowing what's happening with those numbers. I hope I've answered your question.
You did, and another thing that you also mentioned is to increase the possibility of communication with society as a whole, right?
Yes.
So the whole actors that must be convinced of the rules. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think interfaces in general have a very important role in that. So in other work we do at the Directorate of Research is we have a lot of economic studies as well. So whenever you present an economic study, for example, a social housing, we don't just deliver a paper, but we usually have something interactive for people to say, well, yeah, maybe in the scenario you described, this happens, but maybe if you change the price of social housing a little bit, what happens then? And then you can just collectively construct whatever solution you're working towards, instead of just saying, well, the people running the numbers said this, and so we have our hands tied. They said it, we cannot argue with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And I give the floor to Martina Ramella. She's a young researcher of links, and she explained something very different, but I think very interesting because it's very different. We do a research about the UNESCO site and the impacts of COVID. I don't know, but if you know that the 35% of Piedmont is UNESCO World Heritage List, Man Biosphere. So talking about the UNESCO site in Piedmont means to talk about a huge part of the region. And in this period, very strange for us, we try to understand something more about how to manage and how could be the future of the site of the region. So Martina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Now I hope that you can see my screen. Yes, we are okay. We are dealing with this project about the impacts of the COVID on the UNESCO sites and cultural sites in general in our region, so Piedmont. We are Links Foundation. We are a foundation that was born in 2016, thanks to the union between ISMB and SITI. The first one was focused on ICT, and the second one was focused on territorial, environmental, and cultural fields. So from this union in 2016, Links became an important foundation with an international importance, with a father that is a bank foundation and a mother that is an academic world, the Polytechnic of Turin. So we are about 150 researchers, and we are a sort of institutes that is in the middle between the academic world and the real world, the enterprises, the public administration, institution, etc., etc. Our purpose is to develop innovation and technology transfer activities at national and international level. We work in a particular sector of Link Foundation. We work with cultural sites, in particular with UNESCO sites, and for this reason we became in partnership with Polytechnic of Turin, one of the 30 UNESCO chair all over the Italy. Our UNESCO chair is called New Paradigm and Tools for Management of the Biocultural Landscape. And it is important for us because this project that I will explain now, it is something very near to our territory, to our knowledge, to our works. Actually, in Italy, there are 55 World Heritage List sites, and only in Piedmont there are 5 sites that are very interesting because they are serial sites with an area very large, so spread all over the territory. For example, Residenze Sabaute is serial because there are different palaces and castle, etc., all around the territory of Turin. Sacri Monti are sacred monuments all over Piedmont, but also Lombardy, that is the region near Piedmont. Siti Palafitticoli is a prehistoric archaeological site, again serial, transnational, so a lot of elements all around the Piedmont territory and at an international level. Paesaggi Vitivinicoli is vineyard landscape in Piedmont. It is composed by 7 components, so a very spread territory. And Ivrea Città Industriale is an industrial city, so a urban landscape with the reference to the 20th century. Other sites, other UNESCO sites present in Italy are the intangible heritage site, so the ICH sites, ICH list. In Piedmont there are the Muretti a secco, the art of dry stones, walls, and the alpinism. Then there is the network of creative city. In Piedmont, there are 3 of them. One linked to design topic. The Alba is about gastronomy, and Biella is about craftsmanship. MAB, so Man and Biosphere Reserves, is another UNESCO recognition. In Piedmont, there are 3 of these sites. Again, very important because the territory is very spread in all the region. And only 1 geopark in Piedmont. So this is the, sorry. This is the map of the Piedmont. As you can see, the perimeter of the perimeters of these sites are very large. They occupy a large territory of the region itself. So in some way, they represent for us the antennas of the behavior of the cultural site in Piedmont. This project started before the COVID pandemia. The aim was to understand how the UNESCO brand had fallout in the territory. But with the COVID, the aims changed, and the 3 main focus of the project now are monitoring the COVID impacts, collect the best practices, so activities, projects, action that the sites realized during the lockdown, after the lockdown, and how they can share and reply in other territory. And then the collection of virtual tour experiences. So what has been realized during the lockdown, and how has been used, and how will be used in the future. First aim, the monitoring of the COVID impacts. We started with a survey and managers of the UNESCO sites filled in the survey with a Google form. This survey was divided into 12 thematic areas, for example, media, usage of media, the self-image of the site, the education, the quality of the tourism, the business development, etc. And from this survey, we discovered some important things, but it is important to say that this is only the first part of the project, because we think that the same thing we will do again, so repeat the survey, maybe in a different way, to understand if some answers has changed before and after the lockdown. So the first results are about different category. The first one is media and communication, and we asked in the survey if the UNESCO site have used the social media or the website to communicate with the community, with the territory, etc., etc. The 35%, about 35% said that they use the website, etc., to share institutional information. 43% to share useful information for the community and for the territory. So in some way, the institutional website became something useful for the social aspect. At the same time, almost the 30% of the UNESCO sites said that they used the web communication to promote the values of UNESCO. Someone, 35% again, said that the way of using the web and the social media didn't change during the lockdown. Moreover, we wanted to know if they started or if they improved the usage of website and social media to share initiatives, to share elements, to communicate, promote, etc. Well, the 60% of them said that they did during the lockdown. Actually, another important data is this one. The 47, so almost 50% of them said that the UNESCO network, so a network of the similar kind of recognition that they are, realized some activities or initiatives during the emergency related with the emergency topic. So it is important to say that if a cultural site is inside a network, a cultural network in some way, is easier for him to participate to initiatives, different initiatives. About education, we discovered that the relationship that they created with schools, students, teachers, etc. before the pandemia became very important during the lockdown, because they realized many materials, teaching materials, video lesson for the remote and distance education during the lockdown. So they could share the UNESCO and cultural values through these new media. And at the same time, many teachers, schools, institutions tried to contact them during that period to support them in this work. About the digitized products, they say that the 50% and the 40% of them say that they used previously digitized products to post them on the website or social media, so to share information that they had in their archives in some way. Instead, the 74%, so a 9%, decided to create something new during the lockdown period. Only the 13% said that they didn't realize the new activities in this way. Well, during the lockdown, it was very difficult. It was impossible to have tourism in this territory. So the alternative was the virtual tour, the virtual experiences. A lot of the managers say that they used virtual experiences already present on the website, site, and they promoted these kind of experiences. They also posted experiences, activities that were not in their portals, but in other portals, but in some way linked to their work, their site. And at the same time, almost more than 50% of them say that realized ex novo virtual experiences, virtual tour during the lockdown. Only the 26% said that they didn't realize anything. Another important question was about how they considered if they had noticed some difference in the UNESCO sites during the lockdown, and they said that there was this decrease in air and water pollution. This is very important because now these managers are thinking about change something in their UNESCO site to maintain this quality of air and water that was not like in that period before. The main keywords used by the managers were widespread tourism, slow tourism, natural tourism, so something local, something sustainable. Sustainability is another word very present about the mobility, about planning, environment. And at the same time, they underline the importance of digital technology, web sector, and the relation with the small territorial businesses. Actually, education was one of the main focus during the lockdown. Communication, the same. The other important factor is the local enterprises. So they understood that it is important to have relationships with local business, local enterprises, because it is important to experience this UNESCO site in a different way. For example, they are territory in open air, so this is a valid and important theme, especially during this emergency period. They want to rethink about the accessibility to the UNESCO sites in a new view, so the sustainability view. They want to think about a local tourism, and they want to think about packages with a network of different UNESCO site, cultural sites. So it is important to have between these different cultural sites a coordination. The second aim was the collection of the best practices. So we are doing now this part. We decided to focus on different UNESCO sites. The first one is vineyard landscape, so a territory in which there is the relationship between nature and the human. The other one is creative cities, so a urban landscape, and the third one is man and biosphere reserve, so the natural aspect. The third aim is the collection of the virtual tour experiences. Actually, we did it, this part of the work. We collected all the virtual tour experiences in a big database. And now to share all this information and to share step by step all the results of this project, we are realizing a website in which we are explain the aim and the parts of the project itself, and in which we will put all together all the virtual tour experiences of the UNESCO sites like Residenze Sabaute, Sacri Monti, but also of other cultural sites in the region that are in some way linked to the territory itself. So thank you very much for your attention. If you have some question.
Thank you, Martina. And I wait a question from Brazil because we do the research, so we know.
Maybe, may I? Oh, so let me show myself.
Sure.
So Martina can see me as well. Well, congratulations, Martina, and the whole team has produced this important job in research about how UNESCO sites will deal with the waves that Marco has proposed us to think about in the beginning of this section. And when he proposed that, I was thinking about two issues. We don't know how big those waves will be. In some sense, that's what you're trying to do, the highest of, and the impact of these waves, this sequential waves, and UNESCO sites in Piedmont, and also which will be the nature of these waves. Just because, well, I believe there's some chat for me. No, oh yes. Which will be the nature of these waves? Because when we see, and also I could have put this question to Rafael as well. I believe we have different questions because there are different objects seen this morning. But how do you intend to measure and the nature you have already supposed about communication, education, and so on that you have shown us? But how do you intend to measure the impacts of these? I think I'm just thinking about economic and as well the living of the tourism experience that I believe is so important for this issue.
Well, in this presentation, I didn't put all the data that we collect, but in the survey, there were some open questions and some limited questions, okay? And we asked also numeric data. So, for example, about the loss of incomes for museum, for UNESCO sites, for archaeological sites. It depends on what kind of element we were in front of us. So we have some numeric data that we wanted to check now in the past months. We want to check in the future, I mean in a couple of months, and these ones will be our indicators to understand the phenomenon and to understand how the phenomenon change some way of be of the cultural sites. In some cases, it was very difficult for them to understand. For example, now they really don't know how is big the impact on the income of the museums, for example. But we think that in the future months, we will somehow have this kind of data and will realize a monitoring in this way with numeric elements. So I hope that I have had a question.
Yes, thank you.
There was another question from Isabella, so we let you the floor.
Sì. Olá, ciao Martina, come stai?
Ciao.
I start asking excuses for my English. It's not perfect, but I try to make myself understood. And the question is a short question. Is that it's a great initiative from you from LinkedIn Institute. It's a very important initiative, and I have a perception, or maybe I can call it a hope, I don't know, that this situation of the pandemic will strengthen the relationship with the people with the territory, exactly as a side effect of the distance that we are fronting now. And I would like to know, how do you see this in the region of Piedmont? How can it be after this situation is finished? We can start to walk in the territory and have this contact with the heritage. As this could be a possibility. I don't know. I think that I hope that it can happen. Thank you.
I think that in some way this emergency situation permits to have a real relationship between the people and territories, especially because people now are trying to exit from their houses, from their places where they lived 3 months all the time, and they wanted to go to somewhere they feel safe, and at the same time they know. And these places are the places where they live, where they are, and they want to stay in the open air. So maybe not in museums, but surely in parks, surely in the landscape in general, surely in archaeological areas. So I think that in this particular period, this relationship is strengthening. Maybe it will be difficult for other cultural institutions like museums, because they are not in open air. But here in Italy, and also in Piedmont, but in Italy in general, there is an important interesting relationship between the education sector, the cultural sector. So, for example, if children cannot go to the school because of the pandemia, some museums are organizing to create some activities in safety conditions for these young people. So maybe in this way, even if the situation is difficult, some relationships of this kind can be realized anyway.
Yes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I want to say some more words and about the Vanessa question. This is the general framework that we use for impacts. Sorry, it's in Italian, but you have this World Heritage status. The UNESCO say that we have 12 categories of impacts. So the mediatic impacts and the education, the civic identity, the creativity, the tourism, the regeneration program, and so on. And UNESCO tried to apply this general framework with in some sites, and we do the same for Piedmont. We try to develop these 12 different category of impacts with indicators, and we try to take indicator with the data, with the trend, to give to the region an instrument to manage not only one site, but the district, the UNESCO district, all the 30% of the Piedmontese landscape. We think that in Italy it's not possible to work alone. Few UNESCO sites can survive alone. We think that the way, one of the keywords to solve these 3 waves connected with the pandemic crisis is to work together. And so we try to give instrument to the region, to Piedmont region, to use better this challenge, because the UNESCO is a challenge, the UNESCO brand. And then another thing, it's a little story. Alla is a little city for Brazil, 45,000 inhabitants, and it's famous for clothes, for textiles, and it's a creative city for this reason. During this coronavirus crisis, the fabric stopped producing clothes and start producing surgical masks. It's very important in this period for all the region. We think that to brace the community is one way to face up the pandemic crisis, the economical crisis, and also to work for environment. With this research, we try to put in evidence these best practices, to give some guidelines to the other factories, to industry, to site, to become part of community. We ask a lot the relationship between the UNESCO site, the cultural heritage, let me say, UNESCO or something else, but UNESCO and the society. If the cultural heritage is not connected with the society, but also with the economical development, now it is not able to survive to these crises and to the crisis for future. So if I have to put in evidence 2 words, I think that community is one of these, and the second is the manager of the district. That are the two keywords of this study.
Thank you, Marco. And I do believe that we have, in some sense, different challenges in the managing of our sites, but also maybe our task for the future, because it's not just like receiving the impacts of the waves, but surfing the waves, let's say. How can we do that? For example, I was thinking about, in the case of Pampulha, I was thinking about if one way to face the problem of the construction that in response to an economical pressure, and we know that in Brazil, construction is an important activity. If developing not only just patterns for, let me say, not just for constructing, but also for giving a kind of aesthetic quality that we have seen in, of course, there are models, but we have seen in Rafael's presentation. They don't give any quality for the new construction. So maybe our challenge for the future is also developing quality, let's say. And in your case, maybe the challenging is how to connect people with the territory, being aware, being apart. It's a better word. It's apart from the territory, because we don't know if we will have other, we hope not, but we don't know if we have other waves for the pandemia or the epidemic situation. And we have a lot of job to do for the next years, I believe. I'm finished. Can someone hear me? Oh, good.
Yes, we
Yeah? Oh.
hear you, Vanessa.
Sorry. Nobody
Thank
answered.
you. You focused very well the problem. So surfing the waves is the object of our research. Also, how the territories can learn from this crisis and go ahead.
Also in Italy, we have many works to do in the next year. But I think, and only I hope, that this crisis could be also a challenge. And we try to explore, starting from cultural heritage, but also from education, maybe next time, to understand well what could be this challenge. With this crisis, some issues, equity, for example, the real possibility for people to have an access to cultural heritage are put in evidence. I think that we have to change something, and maybe from Italy to Brazil we have a different way to change. I see these two presentations. We are focused on management, but also when you come to Lange and when I come to Pampulha, it's the same. You are focused more than new build. So how to create something new, but in the right way. And we are focused on to manage what we have, because we have not, we talk about the demographic aspect that are very different. And so we have two very different situations, but maybe some point could be similar. The community, work in group, understand each other. This could be something interesting in this period. We are working with ICT on social distance. We say so. Also, you, I think. But I think that the key word for next year will be human connection, non-social distance. Now we have to imagine how to create again and better human connection, not how to create a correct social distance. Not only, let me say, not only. It's a provocation. And I think that it's the same in Italy or in Brazil, and maybe what we have done in the last 20 years is not all correct. We have to change something, and it's a very interesting work, and I think that it's a work that university and research center, as you are and as we are, has in their mission to explain.
I agree, Marco, and I also think that your words are very promising, not only in terms of reflections that we have to make in terms of moving forward with different perspectives. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
It is not the last one, so we are going to have about another subject, another issue, some more reflection, and maybe near the end of July could be the second step. Very good.
And I agree with you that we have much in common, much more in common than we sometimes think we have. Also in terms of the built environment, even though we continue to build a lot of new things, we have a lot of existing structures that could be better reutilized. And this is something that we have a lot to learn with your experience also.
Bene. So thank you very much. Are there some other questions? I think that we can close. We want to talk for an hour and we talk for 2 hours. Huh?
This is also something that we have in common.
This is the story of the lockdown.
Yeah.
Very more words, but for us is always a great pleasure to learn something from you, and it's really one of the best part of our job.
For sure. When we were organizing this first webinar, I thought, no, just 1 hour. It would be impossible for doing it just for 1 hour. We have such more things to talk about, and fortunately, we will have other more. It's okay for also for people to pay attention for the next calling.
So thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Enjoy the summer.
Bye.
I see you enjoy the summer.
It's raining here. It's cold because I'm in the mountain, so